Hi again, welcome back to Gibi School. My name is Duran Ali. Today we'll go over CSS, Precourse. So what is CSS? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet. It's used to style HTML pages, and it was created by Håkon Wormli in 1994. CSS uses property and value, and we'll talk about that. I'll show you how that looks like. The cascading part of CSS means styles applied to parent element will also be applied to children element. And just like HTML, CSS also went through several versions, and the current version is CSS 3. Before CSS, websites looked like this. It was only HTML. You could see the text, you could see the links and things like that, but there was nothing that was organized. There was nothing that looked really pleasant to look at, but it was just informational. If you ever used Microsoft Word, you will see that you have options to change the text. You could change how big the text is, you could change how bold it is, you could change the font type, and you could change a lot of things. You could underline it, things like that. So CSS is basically a code version. It's a coding version of that. So you're basically making the text look nice, different colors, things like that, formatted in a different way. You're using a code to make those changes on a web page. So let's code and see how CSS looks like. We're here at w3schools.com. We went to the CSS section. This is the introduction to CSS. So if we zoom in a little bit, so we talked about what CSS is, cascading style sheet. So CSS basically makes the page look nicer. So we have options here, few options that we can look at. As you can see here, this page, it has a title here, it has a subtitle, it has menu here on the side, it has sidebar, things like that. So you could also style this page in a different way. You could just click this and it will completely change. So this is the power of CSS. Basically now the menu, the navigation is on the right, the title of the page is really big, there's different color. If we try the third one, as you can see, it's plain simple. If we try the fourth one, it's dark, it's different. So you're basically using CSS to make the website feel or look the way that you want. So that's what CSS does, and that's the power of CSS. So why do we use CSS? Basically, you could change the background colors, you could change the font colors, you could change so many things on the page. So let's go through, let's try the syntax. So let's see how the syntax looks like. So we talked about syntax on HTML. Syntax means the way that this code CSS is written. So the rules that you have to follow so that it's written properly. So first you declare something called selector. Selector is, we talked about in HTML, there are tags in HTML. So the tags are called selectors. So you could choose a selector. This means you're targeting something. You're targeting something in HTML. It's either paragraph and you use P, you use H1, you can use different things in HTML. And then after that, you define what you want that element or that tag to look like. So right now we're defining the color first. So the color is called property, as you can see here. So you say the color, I want it to be blue. So and the blue part is called value. So the blue part is, it changes, so you could change to whatever you want, the red, blue, green, whatever you want. And then the H1, the header one, will be the color that you defined here. So this is the text, basically the color of the text. And then you have another rule here. So this rule is the font size. So when you write in the font size or the text size, you basically say font dash size, and then you use pixels. So you say px. So and you will see how big this is. If you use Microsoft Word, you will see that they have 12, they have 1 to like 100 there, and you could customize it the way you want. So pixels, there are other units. So pixels is not the only unit, but we will talk about those units when you start a class. But now just pixels are just different unit to define how big the font is. So as you can see, that's how it looks like. If you want to see how it looks like in like real world, you define the paragraph or the tag in the HTML, and then you say the color, and then you this is called text align. It means it aligns the text to center. It's basically in Microsoft Word when you align the text to the right, to the left, to the middle, things like that. So you use text align, and you can write left, right, and the center. So that's kind of like how it looks like, and that's how you use it. The next thing we'll talk about is colors. We did talk about a little bit colors on HTML, but CSS is where the colors are basically used the most. So we did talk about what colors are, the different type of colors in HTML. If you haven't watched that, you should. So it makes it easy for you to understand what colors are. So colors, we define them in different ways. The most used way is we use something called hex. So hex are color code basically, and it is you use that hashtag or that pound, and then you define 6 characters, sometimes 3, with different values. So right here, as you can see, the red is the first 2, and the green is the middle 2, and the blue is the last 2. So if you change one of them, like if you slide this, you can see it changes. The last 2 numbers change. So if you want to know more about this, there are websites that actually have hex codes. So you could go to Google and type hex code. There's also RGB, which we did talk about. It means red, green, blue. It's exactly the same thing, but it's defined in a different way. So when you're defining it, you use RGB, and then you define the values of the color. So now red, and this is green, blue. So we did talk about this in HTML, so I will not go in depth in that. The main thing to know is that the 2 most important things to know is you could use or 3. You could use RGB, hex, and the color name. So the color name, how do you use the color name? So if we go back to colors, as you can see here, you could define the color name by just typing the name. So if we go here, this H1, the background is tomato. So as you can see, you could type the color. You could type here, let's type something like yellow. And if we run, as you can see, this is yellow. So you could type the color name, but keep in mind that it has to be a color name that is accepted by the browser. So if you use a recently defined color name or color name that's not known that well, it will not render. So keep in mind that there are the browsers, they accept most of the color names, but it's best to use RGB when you're trying to develop a application. Let's also talk about something really important called the box model. So the box model is right here. The box model is what defines how the page is laid out. So the box model basically means that there are few things that you could use to space out the content. As you can see here, even in this website that we're browsing right now, there is a space between this section and this text. There's some space. How is that space defined? How do you know what to put in there? So to do that, you use the box model. So the box model contains something called margin, border, and padding. So right now the content is in the middle, and then there is a padding. Padding means it's between the content and the border, so it will give space between the border and the content. And then there is margin. Margin gives space outside of the content. So we could try it out. So let's see here. Let's test it out. So right here we have a content. So this is the content. There is a huge space of padding in here. That padding is defined by here. So we have 50 pixels. We have 50 pixels of padding, and we have 20 pixels of margin. So the margin, as you can see here, the margin is the space between the border and outside stuff, the outside content, or either the outside wall or the outside content. So if we change that to like something like maybe like 5, there's going to be smaller space here. So if we define that, as you can see, there's a smaller space. If we go ahead and make this one maybe like 1, you see that the text goes all the way to the border. So as you can see, it goes very close to the border. So let's put that 50, or maybe let's say that 20, and you can see that it has a little space. The border itself, then this is how you define the border. So the border is, you could make it as thick as you want. You could change the color of the border. You could change how it looks like. So the border, the way you define it is by typing border, and of course first you have to select the selector in the HTML. So the selector is this div. So div we talked about, I think, on our HTML. But if we haven't, div is just a container. So it's a section of your page. You could put anything in div. So it's just a generic section basically. So it's nothing special. You could just say div, and that means this is just a section, a generic section. So we're defining that div, and we're saying give that div a background color of light gray. So as you can see, this is a light gray. We could change it to whatever we want. Let's say something like light, let's say light blue, as you can see. Yep. So that's how we define the background, and then we define the width. So the width is how big it is horizontally. If we zoom out, as you can see here, the horizontally is this how big it is. So we define it by 300. We can make it smaller, like 200, and then this becomes smaller. As you can see, it becomes taller. We haven't defined the height, which is how tall this is. The height is automatically calculated by the browser, so you could define it too. Most of the time people say they put the height and they say auto means automatic. So every time it gets taller or the content becomes you add more content to it, then the height changes automatically. So let's put this 300, and now you see the border. So the border is defined by just saying border, and then you define how big this is, how thick this is. You say 15 pixels. It means I want it to be 15 pixels thick. And then you say, okay, what type of border do you want? Do you want solid? Do you want there's something called dashed. So if we use dashed, as you can see, it cuts every couple of pixels, so it gives a space there. There are different ways of defining it. So solid is the best one to use. I would say if you're trying to use the dash on other border formats, you have to have a good reason, otherwise it doesn't look good on your page. So keep it in mind. And also border being in this thick is not good, but this is just as example. And you could define the color of the border. You could say something like, let's say blue. It's gonna look interesting. So you could define it to whatever you want. You could say red, and also you could put a hex here. You could put like something like FF, something like 22 AA, something like that, and that's how it looks. So you could put whatever you want. You could put RGB here if you want. We could put RGB. So we say RGB, and then we define, let's say that's the red. We say 0 and then 0, so the border becomes probably red. Yeah, so that's how you define the color. You could define it whatever way you want. And then there's a padding. So the padding is important because it is the space between the text and the border, and usually you want a good padding. Like most of the time you want the text to have some space to breathe, and it looks nicer that way. So don't make it like a huge space, but also not all the way to the wall. It doesn't look good. It looks kind of like claustrophobic for some people to have no padding whatsoever. As you can see here, it's all the way to the wall. So that's, it doesn't look good most of the time. So that's how, and then you have the margin, and we did talk about the margin. So if we put margin 50, you'll see that this box will have a lot of space between the wall, the text, everything. So as you can see here, there's a lot of space around it. So the margin is around it. So that's a box model. Basically, it defines the space around the content, and the content could be anything. It could be paragraph, it could be h1, it could be as we just saw, a div. So the box model is one of the most important aspects of CSS. All right, so let's talk about another important aspect, text, which you could change it the way you want. So you could define it. You could define the text color. You could define the text space, height. You could define the space between the text, the space between lines. So many things you could do. So as you can see here, this is text formatting. The text has like space between it, like each character has a space between it. So if we look at the CSS, so this part is the paragraph, I assume. So as you can see, the text indent. So we have something called text indent. That means there is indent here. So this is the first space, and also Microsoft Word, you have that the text indent. So text indent, you say 50 pixels. So you indent 50 pixels here, and then you say text align. That means how you want to align it. So even in Microsoft Word, you see something called justify. Justify means fit the text in all the sides. So it doesn't go in one side. It just fits the whole space that it has. And also you can make this one left, and it will go to this side. So as you can see, there's going to be space here, and you can say right. Usually, for example, when you write in Arabic, the Arabic language, you want to have the text align to the right because you want things to go from the right. So that is the text formatting. You also have text transform. As you can see here, we have the H1, which is right here, the big font. Text transform, basically what it does is it changes how the text looks like. So you could say uppercase. That means make the whole text uppercase. And there's also something like capitalized, which allows you to capitalize each word instead of just writing that yourself. You could capitalize it just by putting here capitalized. So there's so many ways. And as you can see here, text align has center, and here it has right. So you could define it in different ways. So that is that's how you define the text. There are other options that we could look at. Of course, the color is very important. You could define the color of the font. As you can see here, we define the H1 green. So the H1 green, you could define it whatever you want here. Let's say something like red, and that's how it becomes red. So it's pretty easy to use that way. You could also change the text font, which is right here. We will not talk about it, but you could change the font itself. For example, in Microsoft Word, you have different fonts. You have Arial, you have so many different fonts that you could choose from. We will say usually just go with the one that is safe and that most websites use, something like sans serif or serif. We'll talk about that subject in detail when the classes start. The last thing I want to talk about is display. In CSS, there's different ways to display things. So we touched a little bit about display in HTML. Display basically defines how the elements are going to take this space. Are they going to fill out the whole space, or are they going to take part of the space? So the space is basically like this page. So this page is a space. And if you put a text, is it gonna take the whole thing, or is it gonna stop and move to the next one? Let's say if you put something in between the two lines, is it gonna break and go to the next line? So that's usually what display defines. So there are two main display, I would say even three. There are three main display elements. So the first one is block. Block basically defines if the element is gonna fill out the whole page. So for example, we have elements that are by default they're block. So by default they fill out the whole page, and if you put something next to them, they will move that stuff to the next line. So for example, div is by default a block element or block label element, and also the rest, so h1, p, form, header, footer, and section, they're all they take the whole space. They don't allow other elements to take the same line as them, and we'll see kind of an example how that looks like. There's also inline elements. Inline elements are kind of like friendly, so they allow you to take space. For example, if you want to put something on the left and on the right, you could use this. So let's say if you want to have a text on the right and on the left, you could use these elements. For example, some of the elements that have a default inline element is span. It allows you to define a text within like paragraph, let's say, or something like that, without breaking the line. So I'm talking more about it. We'll see example how that looks like. Also A, which is an anchor, like a link, and then also image. These are kind of like an inline elements. So let's see example of a block element and inline element. For example, if we define, let's say, a div, and we put something in this div. Let's put some text in here, and actually we have to put a lot more text to see the effect. So let's put something like this text. So let's copy this, put it in here, so that we have it fills out the whole page. And let's remove this. So if we have this text, as you can see here, it goes all the way to the right side, and we have to close that div. So as you can see, that fills out the whole page. Let's say we put something next to it. So maybe you expecting if we put something, some text, it's gonna go here. So let's see. Let's put something like some text here. As you can see, it will go to the next line. So it doesn't allow, even if the text is small, like let's say 2 letters, it will just be like, okay, so go to the next line. I'm not gonna allow you to have my whole space. We could see this as an example, but let's actually just try other elements. Let's say paragraph. If we define a paragraph, and it already changed the background, I mean the last one, as you can see, paragraph doesn't even allow you, even it adds its own padding automatically to the top and the bottom, so it doesn't allow you to have like that. If we add like let's say h3, it's going to be big, but if we add h3, as you can see, it doesn't allow you. So let's see another example. So these are called block elements, so they don't allow you to put something next to them, and they just want to take the whole space. So let's change this to an inline element, which is, let's say, span, and it's in inline. So span is friendly, so it's like, okay, so now I finished this space. So span allows you to have an element or a text right after the span element. So that is the power of a span and other elements that are inline. So usually you could change an element that is not an inline, a block, let's say a paragraph, you could change it to an inline. So right now it's refusing this. You could go to CSS and you could say something like P, and then define it and say display. So now if we put something like inline here, you see that the AS goes right next to it. So we change the default to inline. So these are the 2 most important display properties: the block, which usually comes by default, and also the inline, which is also, you could add it to these elements by defining it in your CSS. There's also a display none, which basically defines, it makes the elements disappear. So let's say something like none here. So now the paragraph is going to disappear. So it actually disappears. It's not in the HTML anymore. So none, you use it to get rid of the element that you want to get rid of. So usually, let's say in programming like JavaScript and other programming, you could say if a person clicks this, make the display none, and then it just kind of like disappears. So usually that's how the none is used. It's really important in the programming. So that is CSS. That's how you use most of CSS, and that's how it's defined. There are way more things that we can go over, but I don't want to take too much time. Try your best to answer the questions, and I'll see you in the next lesson.